Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'll try to help you with endgame technique and ideas, and also show you a great example about passed pawns. Also, this lesson is dedicated to former world champion Petrosian. Let's see this game that Petrosian played against Aganalian back in 1945. The game started with d4, knight f6, c4, d6, knight c3, and e5. This is called the Old Indian defense. It's a very solid opening, however, it has more twos to it than you'd think. Probably White, playing a superior opponent, chose to simply trade and try to go to an endgame. A lot of weaker players consider that going into an endgame gives them a better chance to hold the game and avoid complications, makes their life easier. Reality is, on the other hand, that just because the queens are off the board, it does not necessarily mean that the game is closer to a draw. You may wonder about this trade of queens, which forced Black to give up the right of castle. It's true that Black no longer can castle in this game. However, at the same time, by exchanging the queens, that very subject of castling becomes less important than it is as long as queens are on the board. As you'll see, the Black king will find very quickly a very safe and sound location. White continued with bishop g5, a very natural move, creating a pin on the Black knight. And Black responded by playing c6. This is a very typical and good and important move in these type of endgames, to make sure the White knight will not be able to jump to d5. Also, just as importantly, Black has opened up that key, wonderful hiding place for the Black king. After c6, White played knight to f3. You may wonder why White did not capture on f6. It's true that the Black pawn structure would have been somewhat ruined by that. However, there are two things. On one hand, it would cost White his pair of bishops. So as a compensation, Black would have a pair of bishops, while White wouldn't. On the other hand, those type of bishop takes knight and doubling up are usually even more dangerous when the Black king has already castled to the king's side and there are still queens on the board. So that element here doesn't play any role whatsoever. So it's only the issue of having double pawned. But as I said, Black is being compensated for that by having the pair of bishops advantage. The game proceeded with knight f3, attacking the pawn on e5, and Black played his natural move, knight d7, protecting the pawn. White castled to the queen side, and now White threatens to capture the pawn on e5 using the pin. And a very typical move, if you perhaps think of playing this opening, make sure you remember your king belongs on c7. A bit surprisingly, the king has a very secure and good position there, because this pawn on c6 controls the key b5 and d5 squares, so the White knight cannot appear there to give any kind of checks. It's quite surprising that perhaps White's most natural looking move, which is to play e3 to then develop the light squared bishop from f1, would already cause White pretty serious problems. Because Black would play bishop b4, threatening to take on c3, ruining White's pawn structure on the queen side, as well as combine that with a threat of then playing knight e4 and targeting on f2 as well as on c3. For example, after a move like king c2, white would be in pretty serious trouble after takes. If king takes, things are even worse with knight e4 check. And even if pawn takes, knight e4, white is in pretty serious trouble. After king c7, e3, bishop b4, if right now white would try to take on f6, black would take back with the knight to maintain or renew those same threats of bishop takes knight and then knight e4. And now if knight takes pawn, then even then bishop takes, pawn takes, knight e4. Of course, it's important to notice that knight e4 doesn't just attack a pawn, but it, by capturing the pawn on f2, would create a fork. And if white wants to protect against that, of course, black could capture the pawn on c3 right now, but black can do even better by playing bishop e6, attacking the pawn on c4, and black is having a superior position. Let's go back. After king c7, that explains white cautious move, playing a3, preventing the black bishop from coming to b4. But again, black was ready for active play and played knight g4, attacking the pawn on f2. If white would try to protect that pawn with knight e4, black could respond by chasing that knight away immediately by playing f5. White pretty much has only one choice, namely playing bishop h4, protecting the pawn. And now a very important move for black, f6. On one hand, protecting the pawn on e5, and also in some cases preparing to play g5 himself. White better chases this knight back to release the bishop from the need of protecting the f2 pawn. The knight has no choice but to retreat. And white played g4 to give room for the bishop to develop on g2 and also to prevent black from playing knight f5. Knight went to f7. White played bishop g3. And now another typical and important move, not immediately knight c5, even though that's where black's knight belongs, because then the knight could be chased away immediately. However, first black plays a5, a very important preventive move, preventing white from playing b2 to b4. And white played knight e4, using the moment that there is a pin on the pawn on e5. Also, white threatens right now to jump with the knight to e6 with a check and then capture black's bishop on f8. Of course, black doesn't need to allow that and therefore played knight c5. And white finally got the moment to play e3. As the knight still is safe on d4 because of the pin, and black played a tricky move, knight d6. At first, you may think that the idea is to unpin the pawn on e5 and now the knight on d4 is hanging. However, reality is that that knight still is not hanging. Because, for example, if white would play bishop e2, then after pawn takes, and knight moves away even with a check, king c2, and let's say the knight gets protected, white could win the knight back by playing c5 and using the pin on the knight. Let's go back. The main threat, the main idea of the move knight d6 actually is to go to e4 with the knight and go after white's bishop on g3. White played knight c2 and knight de4 arrived. Now black has major threats to ruin white's pawn structure, either to capture on c3 or to capture on g3. White traded knights and here made an error. It was somewhat better to play rook g1 right now to be ready that when knight captures bishop on g3, the white rook could recapture, not needing to double up his pawns by f takes g3. White in the game continued with bishop h4. However, black played g5 anyway. Bishop retreated to g3 and black played a very important move, h5. Usually in most games the time comes that one side or the other needs to open the position, and opening the position means typically that you're offering a trade of pawns, and that's exactly what is happening here right now. Black is opening the h file to create a target, namely the h3 pawn there, to attack. Pawn captured pawn and came knight takes g3. Pawn takes and rook takes h5. Let's evaluate the position right now. What has happened so far? Amazingly, black hasn't yet moved his rook and two bishops, and in fact his remaining piece, the rook, also just made its first move. Nevertheless, black has a major advantage. First of all, white is not very well developed himself. The only piece that kind of is not an initial square is the knight on c2, and of course white has castled. But the problem is that white is stuck with chronicle weaknesses, namely the pawn on h3 and also somewhat the isolated pawn on e3. But the major problem is the one on h3. So what should be black's plan in the near future? Well, certainly to finally develop his bishops, move the bishop from c8, mostly to let the other rook in the corner out, and for the same reason move the bishop from f8 also to c5, perhaps to target the pawn on e3, and again also to get out of the 8th rank so the other black rook can move to h8 and to double up against the pawn on h3. So that pawn became now the clear target. After rook h5, the game continued with bishop g2. Bishop e6, as predicted. Now the pawn is hanging on c4, so poor bishop has to go back just where it came from. Pretty sad news from white's perspective. And now another very typical idea for such positions and in general for this opening. Black played a4. These type of moves are really effective because if you look at it this way, that one pawn on a4 holds off two white pawns. Why? Because if this b pawn would advance to b4, black could do en passant. So therefore, these type of moves are really effective and very much limiting the mobility of the white pawns. White continued with rook d2, presumably getting ready to double rooks perhaps on h2 to protect the h3 pawn, or also even to go to f2 and target black's f6 pawn. Black responded by playing bishop c5, everything as planned, developing the two bishops in order to open the 8th rank for the black rook to swing to the other side. And white was looking for counterplay, rook f2, but then f5. Now it's true that the bishop on e6 no longer directly targets the pawn on h3, but black developed new threats. White played rook g1, getting out of the h-file. However, I have to say it certainly does not look very good to have two rooks on the same diagonal where black's dark squared bishop is. Came rook a to h8, king d2, protecting the pawn on e3, and now finally f4. This move basically is using the pin, because after pawn takes and pawn takes, the white pawn cannot take a second time on f4 because the rook would be hanging. And now the pawn on h3 is getting in trouble. White continued with g4, attacking the rook. And this is a nice moment in the game. While it's certainly true that the black rook could retreat, maintaining a significant advantage and probably maybe is even a simpler win, but Petrosian is famous for one thing in particular, and that's namely for the exchange sacrifices. I think there aren't many players like him, before or after, who like to sacrifice a rook for a bishop and knight, or bishop and knight and the pawn, as he did. And this example also demonstrated nicely. He played rook h3. Bishop took and rook took. Of course, here black already got one pawn and two more are hanging, the one on c4 and e3. White played king d3, protecting the pawn on c4. Bishop e3. White has no choice but to take. Now, of course, rook takes, forcing the king away from the c4 pawn. King d2, and black got the third pawn for the exchange. That is, of course, already material advantage. And just as importantly, black has two connected passed pawns, which with the help of the king and the rook are pretty much unstoppable. The game continued with rook e1, forcing the exchange of rooks pretty much, and e4. With the help of the bishops, white cannot hold the game. Actually, white resigned in this position, but let me just illustrate it with a couple of sample variations why that happened. If rook h2, e3. Now, for example, if rook h5, the pawn simply advances and then promotes. Or, if instead of rook h5, white would be trying to hold off the f-pawn by playing rook h3, then bishop e6, attacking the pawn on g4, rook h5, f3. And again, the pawns are too far advanced, and there's nothing that white can do. For example, after rook g5, just check, and whether the king moves to e2 or f1, the answer is same. With bishop c4, it's game over. A beautiful example of endgame technique displayed by former world champion Tigran Petrosian. What did we learn from this game? Well, we learned that just because the queens are off the board, it doesn't mean that there are no more tactics in the game. We also learned that just because black lost the right to castle, it's not the end of the world, especially once the queens are off the board. If you like this game, you may want to follow it up and try it out playing this opening for black. If you like quiet positions or playing endgames, this may be a good idea for you. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this simple-looking endgame composed by the famous composer Ring, it's white to move and win. As usual, I suggest you take your time and try to figure out the exact correct sequence on your own before you listen further and look at the solution. The correct solution is starting with rook f6. Well, this first move is very natural, obviously, attacking both black bishops at the same time. However, it's not hard to recognize that black can easily escape, at least for the moment, by first giving a check and then just moving the second bishop away somewhere. Well, that somewhere is of course not such a simple question. If the bishop moves on the g2 or h3 diagonal, then the white rook will just fork with rook a6. So that issue is resolved. Okay, but there are still a number of squares on the other diagonal. How about that? Well, let's check it out. For example, bishop e2, which is the best response. Then white attacks the bishop further, rook e6. Now, if the black bishop returns to f1, then all of a sudden the white rook appears on e1, attacking the bishop, and regardless where this bishop goes now, the next move is to pin the bishop with the rook on a1. It cannot run away, and even this check will not solve the problems because now the two bishops are in a skewer. Let's go back again. After bishop e6, how about bishop c4, again attacking the rook? Well, and the rook in turn again attacks the bishop. Now the bishop has to be real careful where to go, because if it goes to any other place than b5, then the rook a4 check is the threat. Bishop b5, and now rook e5. Again, if the bishop moves anywhere else but to a4, then immediately rook a5 comes and forks the king and the bishop. But bishop a4 check. And now black has all the time in the world to move either the bishop away or the king away, but it still does not help. Pretty amazingly, it doesn't matter whether black moves either of the bishops, when white will just fork with rook a5, or will try to move the king out of the fork, then also rook a5, simply putting the two bishops on a skewer, and one of the bishops will be lost, and then a rook and pawn versus bishop endgame is winning not very difficult. A pretty amazing endgame, a dance of the rook and bishops. Well, this is it for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed, learned some endgame ideas, and of course enjoyed the jewel of the week. Thank you for listening, and so long until next time.